Bueno, les vuelvo a dar la bienvenida. Les recuerdo que tenemos un canal en inglés y otro en español en la parte de abajo, a un lado de donde dice reacciones. Ahí pueden escoger ustedes si quieren escuchar la conversación en español o en inglés. Y les agradeceríamos que tuvieran sus micrófonos en mute, que no se escuche, para que podamos oír con mayor claridad a las personas que nos acompañan. Y ya en el momento en que ustedes quieran intervenir, ya quitan el mute, por favor. Pues muy buenos días en México, buenas noches en España. Es un honor darles la bienvenida a esta presentación de un lanzamiento en Iberoamérica de editorial Vaso Roto. Se trata del libro, la biografía sobre Elizabeth Bishop, esta autora de culto, titulado Elizabeth Bishop, Un milagro para el desayuno, publicado por Vaso Roto Ediciones y que por primera vez se presenta en el mercado de Iberoamérica en español. Este libro es autoría de la gran escritora Megan Marshall, a quien le damos la bienvenida y que nos acompaña hoy. Muchas gracias a esta ganadora del Premio Pulitzer por acompañarnos para hablar de su libro, de la versión en español de esta obra. Y nos acompañan también María Fuentes, delegada editorial de Vaso Roto en España, así como María Covarrubias, que es quien está haciendo la traducción simultánea. Vamos a comenzar con una primera intervención de María Fuentes, delegada editorial de Vaso Roto, quien nos va a contar sobre este enorme lanzamiento para el verano en nuestro idioma en Iberoamérica de Un milagro para el desayuno, la biografía de Elizabeth Bishop, escrita por Megan Marshall. Bienvenida, María, adelante.
No te
You're
escuchamos,
muted.
María.
Muchas gracias, Lorena. Y bueno, pues buenos días en el continente americano y buenas tardes, noches en el continente europeo. Quiero agradecerles a todos los que se han unido para compartir este ratito para hablar de una de mis autoras y de las autoras favoritas de Vaso Roto, que es Elizabeth Bishop. Quiero agradecerle muchísimo a Megan Marshall que esté aquí, pero sobre todo que nos haya confiado su maravillosa obra a Vaso Roto y que hayamos podido trabajarla tan bien como la hemos trabajado con ella. También quiero agradecerle, por supuesto, a los traductores, que son Laura de la Parra en la parte de la prosa y a Janet Lozano Clarion en la parte de la poesía. Yo quiero ser muy breve. Lo único que quiero contaros es por qué Elizabeth Bishop y por qué esta biografía sobre Elizabeth Bishop. Para ello es esencial conocer a Vaso Roto. Vaso Roto es una editorial hispano-mexicana fundada en 2006 por Janet Lozano Clarion con la misión de acercarle al lector hispanohablante la mejor poesía, independientemente del sitio en donde haya sido creada o del idioma en el que haya sido creada. Después de más de 15 años, de 18 años, este año cumplimos nuestra mayoría de edad, podemos decir que somos una editorial asentada, que tiene su prestigio, que tiene sobre todo sus lectores, que es lo más importante, y que han publicado ya más de 300 títulos en más de 33 idiomas diferentes, siempre en cuidadas ediciones bilingües. Ahora bien, eso es ahora. Tendríamos que remitirnos a cuando Vaso Roto empezó su andadura. Y cuando Vaso Roto empezó su andadura, hubo que cimentar la casa, ¿no? Hubo que poner los pilares. Y para mí, los pilares que sustentan Vaso Roto, los pilares en los que se basó Janet para crear todo su catálogo, fueron fundamentalmente tres poetas maravillosas. Una es Alda Merini, italiana, y las otras dos son dos poetas curiosamente de origen canadiense, pero que aparecen en este libro maravilloso, que es La escuela de Wallace Stevens, que Janet trabajó con Harold Bloom. Una de estas autoras, este libro se publicó en 2011, y una de estas autoras es, cuando se publicó, una desconocidísima en el ámbito hispanohablante, Anne Carson, y la otra es Elizabeth Bishop. Me gustaría leer un pequeño fragmento de lo que Harold Bloom dice en la introducción sobre Elizabeth Bishop. Es en tal grado meticulosa y original que su obra no ha logrado ser leída con la profundidad que merece. De ahí la tendencia a subestimarla. Con frecuencia se elogió su ojo. Sin embargo, su verdadero logro radica en ver lo que no puede verse y decir lo que no puede decirse. Me gustaría deciros que Vaso Roto fue la primera editorial que publicó a Elizabeth Bishop, pero os estaría mintiendo. Cuando salió este libro ya había una antología parcial de su obra y ya había algunas traducciones universitarias. Pero su obra no se entendía, y mucho menos en el ámbito hispanohablante. Entonces, Vaso Roto decide hacer una traducción completamente exhaustiva y rigurosa de su obra completa. Nos llevó años. En 2016 aparece Poesía completa de Elizabeth Bishop, que incluye los 4 poemarios que Elizabeth Bishop publicó en vida, pero también incluye sus poemas inéditos. Unos poemas que se trabajaron con su albacea literaria, Fran Vidal, y que evidentemente se publicaron siguiendo todos los deseos que la autora había marcado en su testamento. Poco después se publica también la prosa completa. Antes habíamos publicado la antología que hizo de la poesía brasileña, una antología de poesía brasileña con sus traducciones pasadas al castellano y 2 biografías que se centraran única y exclusivamente en el periodo en el que Elizabeth Bishop vivió en Brasil. Ahora viene la pregunta. Ahora entendemos por qué la importancia de Elizabeth Bishop para la literatura y ahora por qué es un pilar para Vaso Roto. En Vaso Roto nos gusta pensar que hablamos de constelaciones, que creamos constelaciones poéticas. Unos autores nos llevan a otros autores. Elizabeth Bishop es un pilar porque gracias a ella se constituye la cosmogonía poética, una de las cosmogonías poéticas más importantes de Vaso Roto. A través de Elizabeth Bishop llegamos a autoras como Adrienne Rich, Helen Bender o el incomparable Robert Lowell. Entonces es una autora que nos ha dado muchísimos regalos y gracias a ella hemos conocido mucho. Ahora bien, ¿por qué después de todos estos años nos lanzamos a publicar Elizabeth Bishop, Un milagro para el desayuno? La biografía más exhaustiva, completa y artísticamente poética que yo he podido leer. Bueno, me gustaría deciros que Elizabeth Bishop muchas veces ha sido considerada como una poeta pues, más lejana, se alejaba del grupo confesional, de la poesía confesional, etc. Pero precisamente, Octavio Paz, de hecho, dijo que definió a Elizabeth Bishop como el poder de la reticencia o el poder de la contención. Pero a veces en su obra salen fogonazos como en el poema Un arte, que a mí me fascina, y os voy a leer un pequeño fragmento. Un arte. No es difícil dominar el arte de perder. Tantas cosas se empeñan en perderse que su pérdida no es ningún desastre. Pierde algo cada día, acepta el sobresalto de las llaves perdidas, de la hora malgastada. No es difícil dominar el arte de perder. Perdí el reloj de mi madre y fíjate, la penúltima o última de 3 casas que amé ya no está. No es difícil dominar el arte de perder. Perdí 2 ciudades adorables y todavía más, alguna de mis posesiones, 2 ríos, un continente. Los echo de menos. Pero no fue ningún desastre. Cuando yo leía este poema, necesitaba saber profundamente cuáles fueron esos 2 continentes, cuáles fueron esas casas, qué pasó con el reloj de su madre. Y gracias al maravilloso trabajo que Megan Marshall ha hecho, he podido irlos descubriendo con una lectura fructífera y poética. Megan, te agradezco muchísimo el regalo que nos has hecho.
Thank you, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. And it's thrilling to me that Elizabeth Bishop has been taken so to heart by Vaso Roto, because she really is. This is one of the reasons I decided to write this biography, which came out a few years ago in English. There was a biography written in the early 1990s, but her reputation has really soared since then. She had won kind of every prize there was in the United States and even an international, the Neustadt Prize. before her death at 68 in, uh-oh, it's telling me I switched to a different language, which I didn't mean to do. And I'm going to go back to my English. Okay. Sorry. At any rate, you know, she won this International Neustadt Prize, the first woman and the first American to win that. But she was really known mostly to poets. And since her death at 68 in 1979, just a few years after I had been her student in a Harvard class in 1976, you know, interestingly, her reputation really began to rise. It was partly because a collection of her letters were published, a collection of her letters with Robert Lowell. She died with no direct descendants, so her papers went really right to the archive and right to biographers and scholars who wanted to learn, as Maria said, what was the life that gave birth to these poems. What I tried to do in my biography was to kind of write the poems back into the life. There are only 100 of her poems that she published. Maria mentioned the others that were unpublished that have also come out in recent years. But she was so exacting and so ambitious to write poems that really expressed her deepest feelings. She said, writing poetry is like thinking with your feelings. That's what she was trying to do. And very early on, she said, you know, if I could just write one poem that would be immortal, that would be, you know, all that really mattered to her. Of course, she kept writing more than that, but that poem that Maria read from One Art, The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master, really, that was one of her last poems, published, I think, in 1975, about a breakup that she'd experienced, but it took in all the loss that she'd experienced in a long life, going back to her father's death when she was 8 months old, and her mother's mental instability, and Elizabeth Bishop essentially grew up as an orphan without the father, and her mother institutionalized, and then lovers who you know, died of broken hearts, that sort of thing. All of that was in that poem, The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master, a very wry and heartfelt one that she referred to as her tearjerker. That poem has really caused her reputation to rise. What I was going to say was, I'm very pleased with this translation. My Spanish isn't very strong, but I can tell that the poems are very well translated by Jeanette Lozano and the prose by Laura Fernandez. It's so important that the translators of this book really understood the interplay between the poetry and the prose. There are a lot of full poems quoted in the book that are meant to help a reader who, you know, not all readers think they can understand poetry. And this is part of my goal of the book, why I have interwoven my own story of getting to know Elizabeth Bishop as my teacher with her life story, so that the reader can, by identifying with me when I was a college student learning poetry, through that learn the poetry as well. And the title itself, A Miracle for Breakfast, refers to one of Elizabeth Bishop's early poems, which is a sestina, and that's the form that I used to write this book. The book is sort of a prose sestina. A sestina is a poem of 6 stanzas with 6 lines each, and the end word of each line is repeated in a specific way. So the end words, well, anyway, you can just see them beautifully in here. I don't know, you can probably read this yourself. I hope you have copies. This is the end of the sestina. The last 6 stanzas starts here at the beginning of the book, and the last line here ends with balcony. And then the chapter about Elizabeth Bishop is called Balcony. I've used those 6 end words as chapter titles, and they really follow Elizabeth's life. Balcony, she's starting out. Crumb, she feels like just kind of worthless. What's she going to be? That's her early 20s. Coffee, she moves to Brazil. River, she stays in Brazil, and things get complicated. Life is flowing. And then there's, let's see, how many have we gone through? Miracle and Sun. Oh, River, Miracle and Sun. Anyway, I won't spoil the plot for you, but it was so important to me that this poem was translated well with those end words accurate, so that then the titles of the chapters would make sense and the reader can follow my whole program there. And I'll tell you a little secret that Sestina ends with 3 lines that use all those 6 words in it, and I made sure to use those 6 words in the very last sentence of my book. So when you get there, you'll see it. Let me think. I was going to just say a little bit more about, oh, yes. So there had been a biography published in the early 90s, but that was a time when it wasn't really, you couldn't write so openly about same-sex romantic life. And so by the time I was writing, there were more letters from Elizabeth Bishop that she exchanged with her lovers. Those had come to light. There was a series of letters she'd written to her psychoanalyst in the 40s that revealed a lot about a very painful childhood, an abusive uncle, her sort of early sexual awakening, that was in those letters. There's just so much more to work with, that a whole new biography needed to be written. And since I had known her, I really felt I could give a kind of wider perspective. So the chapters that are focused on Bishop, you're following her life, and then you get a little chapter where I'm meeting her for the first time, and you're stepping back and seeing how she interacts. She was a very shy woman, but she invited our class to a party, and we got to meet her in her apartment in Boston on the waterfront and see, the Brazilian artifacts that she had around her, and see her in a whole new light, which I think was really important to open up to the reader. So I'm going to get a little drink of water, and maybe we can start taking some questions. Here we go. I guess I also want to say that Spanish was a language that was very meaningful to Elizabeth Bishop. She studied it in the 1930s and 40s, and she traveled to Mexico, was there for 6 months, and met Pablo Neruda, who was there on a posting in 1942, became very close friends with him. She translated a few of Octavio Paz's poems, not published, and a very meaningful poem to her was an elegy by Miguel Hernandez, a Spanish poet who died in prison at the end of the Civil War. That elegy was very meaningful to her in writing ultimately what became that great poem, One Art.
Muchas gracias
Thank you.
Por esta introducción sobre la obra, y quisiéramos darles la palabra a las compañeras y compañeros de la prensa. Quien quisiera hacer una intervención o pregunta, por favor. De las compañeras.
I'll say also, Elizabeth Bishop said that translating, she found it very hard to do. It's like trying to put your feet into gloves. So I have a great admiration for anyone who does it well.
Bueno, yo quisiera preguntarte, Megan, ¿a cuántos idiomas se ha traducido esta biografía, además del español y su original inglés?
Yeah, Spanish is the first translation that I've had. Some of my other biographies have been translated into Japanese, actually, and maybe that will be next for Elizabeth Bishop. But it's available in English pretty widely. And I think one of the keys to this translation was that Jeanette had already translated these poems into Spanish quite wonderfully. And so it was not easy, but it made a lot of sense to go ahead with this biography. I don't think there are any other biographies of Bishop in any other language than English.
Adelante, Enrique Vázquez, por favor. ¿Tiene una pregunta?
Sí, a mí me gustaría saber cómo ¿Qué es lo que más le ha llamado la atención a la autora respecto a las reacciones de los lectores, lo que le han manifestado los lectores? No sé, si ella como...
That's a good question.
Sí.
I think there are kind of two
¿Qué es lo que más le ha llamado?
two types of response. Maybe you could mute because we're getting a little feedback. First is from people who said, I thought I couldn't understand poetry, and they were reluctant to read a biography of a poet. And they said that they, you know, my whole plan to kind of make this an introduction to poetry as well as an introduction to Bishop and her poetry seemed to have worked. So that has made me very happy. Then there are responses from people who knew Bishop's poetry well and even knew Elizabeth Bishop, and they I've been glad to hear that they feel I really captured her personality, captured her character, and showed things that they had not known about before. She was a very private woman, and I didn't want to, I wanted to respect that, but I also wanted to show that she, you know, the passion that she had for the women in her life. And that has been very moving to people, to find that these relationships that she generally described as, this is my friend, or this is my assistant, were deep and loyal and intense, passionate love relationships that were, you know, one of my favorite poems of hers is called The Shampoo, which she wrote after falling in love with Lota de Macedo Soares in Brazil. It's very, just the slightest bit suggestive of a romantic relationship. And she had a lot of trouble publishing that. She was published all the time in the New Yorker, but they wouldn't publish this poem. It was too risky for them. This is in the 50s. And the New Republic finally did. But I think that, you know, scared her off from writing outright love poems. There are some love poems that were not published, and that they are also in my book. But anyway, so I've been very happy to find that people who didn't know her felt excited to learn poetry and learn about her, and people who did know her felt that I got it right. Thank you.
Gracias.
Adelante, Pilar Martín, y enseguida Luis Carlos Sánchez, por favor.
Hola, Megan, encantada. Saludos a todos. Me gustaría que nos hablaras. Yo coincido con lo que ha comentado María sobre el carácter poético, la visión poética que tiene este libro, una mirada muy especial, y me parece también muy interesante su estructura, ¿no? La forma en que has hecho la estructura del libro. Me gustaría que nos hablaras un poco de cómo has llegado a esta idea de estructura y a este carácter poético del libro.
Thank you so much. Yeah, she's referring to the alternating of very brief memoir passages where I track my connection with Elizabeth Bishop, alternating with the longer biographical ones, and you know that there's sort of two plots. There's a plot of Megan, you know, wanting to become a writer, and finally towards the end having that vision begin to be realized. It's sort of the coming into realization of wanting to be a writer, as Bishop's own life as a writer is coming to a close. It's kind of poetic in that way. And I don't want to give anything away, but I didn't really get along with Elizabeth Bishop in the class. I thought she was mad at me. In fact, she was mad at me. So that is resolved there. But I really wanted to separate those strands. I didn't want to be popping in and out of the narrative of her life. I needed to step back from it. But I also, and I don't know if this is clear in the book, but Elizabeth Bishop struggled with alcoholism, you know, pretty much from the first time she began to drink in college. And I had grown up with a father with a drinking problem. And I, as a result of that, really had very little patience for alcohol, people who had troubled relationships because of their alcoholism, which she certainly did. And in writing my little autobiographical section, I was able to step back and not judge her with the eyes of someone who was, you know, the adult child of an alcoholic. And I could really sympathize with the struggle that she had. She wasn't happy with that about herself either. So I that was part of my thinking about how to separate them. And I don't know, it was an experiment. I had written 2 other biographies in a more traditional way, and you know, one of them won the Pulitzer Prize, and I thought, now's the time to try something new. I'm glad it's working for you. Thank you.
Adelante, Luis Carlos Sánchez, y después Reina Paz y Mónica Maristain, por favor. Gracias.
Sí, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Yo tengo un par de preguntas. La primera es respecto al trabajo de Megan como biógrafa y la admiración que necesariamente debe tener el biógrafo por el personaje que aborda, que nos pueda platicar acerca de esta admiración que sentía por Bishop y si es esta admiración la que, digamos, le lleva a meterse en su vida más a profundidad. Y en segundo lugar, quisiera saber, como bien lo empieza describiendo, este dolor que Bishop siempre llevaba en el interior, ¿cuál cree que es, qué cree que era para ella, para Bishop, la poesía? ¿Qué significaba para Bishop la poesía? Gracias.
Great questions. The admiration I had for her, you know, I think this was actually a good exercise for me as a biographer because I admired her as a poet. She had hurt me as a aspiring poet, and I wasn't sure I would be able to come to like her as I wrote the book, which is another reason I separated out the my personal story. But I think there's a notion called sympathetic identification. I think that's something that the biographer, if you're lucky, you go through. You've chosen a subject who is admirable, who, in her case, I mean, even the way she treated me, I began to understand as part of her, it's just who she was in life. She couldn't always put herself in somebody else's shoes. She was a frightened, lonely orphan, really, at heart. And she needed people to shore her up. That was a lot of what she was doing in her relationships, was finding people who could be supportive of her, even as she would sometimes then come to resent that dependence, because she knew essentially she was on her own. She was alone. So the pain that she felt was the pain of an orphan. And a lot of experiences, you know, then being shuttled from one relative's house to another. In one place, the place she lived the longest, she was living with her aunt and uncle, and the uncle was abusive. She was glad to get off to boarding school and to camp. At camp, there was a female counselor who seduced her when she was just 13 or 14, which she kind of liked, but also kind of didn't, you know, that's not right. She liked the attention she got, but she realized this was inappropriate. All of this is new material in this book. So, and in college, you know, in high school, she would come home to that, she was in the boarding school, she'd come home to the aunt and uncle, but once she was in college, she rarely went home there. She would sometimes stay in a hotel because she had no place to go on the vacation. She had a little bit of money, so she could stay in a kind of not very nice hotel, or she could go to friends' houses. One of her friends said that in boarding school, she had 300 books of poetry in her room. And you can see that she's building her home. But did she have a home? That was one of the great things about falling in love in Brazil, was suddenly she did have a home and someone to support her who would build her a study where she could work. But I think, so what did poetry mean to her? It's interesting to me that she started writing poetry very young, and she wrote like crazy in the summer camp and in high school. And loved to go to a secondhand bookstore on Cape Cod where she could pick up poetry. She was very prolific as a poet in those ages, and even in the summer camp, they took turns publishing a log for the campers. She wrote hers in verse. So why did she, when she, you know, refined her ambition and began practicing as an adult poet, why did she slow down? Well, of course, she was very a perfectionist, but I think she also, that's when she began to see that she couldn't write just anything that came to her. She envied Robert Lowell. She said, all you have to do is write down the names, you know, the people in his family. He didn't have to hide his loves. She was hiding, you know, she was hiding embarrassment about her parents. She was hiding her love for women. She was hiding her alcoholism. So I think that slowed her down, but at the same time as the poetry was like a life raft for her. That's what I'd say. And it was
Muchas
great poetry.
gracias.
You know, many people write poetry for that reason, and that's not always good. But she had the mind for it. She read. She was kind of self-educated. This before there were, you know, graduate programs in poetry. She made herself the poet she was.
A continuación voy a leer la pregunta de Reina Paz del periódico La Crónica. Me gustaría saber qué tanto influyó la soledad en la infancia de Bishop para la creación de su poesía. Si ese encuentro con ella misma le daba el valor para nunca abandonar la literatura. Gracias.
She read a lot in childhood, and her aunts were great readers and read to her, very supportive of her writing. There's one really wonderful poem of hers. I mean, there are probably several poems where she's writing about herself as a child, but one in particular that has just the title Sestina, and I quote a fair amount of it in the book, which recalls the day. It's another sestina with these 6 end words that are repeated, different ones. She recalls the day in Nova Scotia when, as a child, her mother that night had been taken off to the mental hospital. And this is a morning in the breakfast that after that, where she's sitting with her grandmother and they're both crying. And the child, she doesn't say whether it's a girl or a boy, which I think is very interesting because she did kind of, in a certain way, she was a tomboy, what we would call a tomboy back in those days. And so it's just a child, and the child is drawing. You know, the child probably can't write yet, but the child is drawing, the child is making art, and the grandmother is weeping into the porridge that she's stirring on the stove. It's a beautiful poem, and it really preserves that moment. There's also, she did write a few short stories, and one's called In the Village that also recalls that time. So I think, as many writers do, she was drawing on her childhood experience and her childhood feelings. As I said, she said poetry is thinking with one's feelings. And she wanted a poem, this was kind of her own idea of it, that a poem should be able to enact the thought process. It should show the mind in action. It should show the mind in action. And that's something that she was very good at. Something that's typical of her poems is sort of making these asides or correcting herself, or it's kind of conversational, which is something she learned a bit from Marianne Moore, who was a mentor to her, an older woman poet, and even T.S. Eliot in a way, with many different kinds of diction. But Elizabeth's voice is always her voice, or almost always her voice. There are a few poems that speak through someone else's voice, but and it's an enchanting one. Thank you.
Gracias. Mónica Maristain pregunta, el arte de perder es un poema y ella misma es una poeta muy ajustada a nuestro tiempo. ¿Cree que ahí se mantiene su vigencia?
Yes, you know, the poets who were, you know, really kind of getting a lot of attention when she was still alive in the 1960s and 70s, were many of them known as the confessional poets. And, you know, Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell was leading the way, kind of bearing their souls, and often in very particular ways. And Elizabeth Bishop, although there was a lot of emotion in some of her poems, she was much more drawn to writing a kind of poetry of that in the end, I think speaks more widely, because it's not just pinned to a particular event in a particular person's life. We all can feel that loss. There is some particularity to that poem, but you can see there actually, and I write a lot about that poem and how it came to be, that initially it was about her lover, Alice Methvessel, who was going to leave her in that fall of 1975, I think it was, and her feelings of loss about that. And there's particular details that you can identify as Alice. But as she refined it, she moved farther away from those particular details, and now it could be Lotta, who had died of suicide or an overdose as their relationship was falling apart in 1967, I think it was. So that is the elegy she'd always wanted to write and was working on when she was trying to translate the Hernandez elegy. So yes, I think that poem, and there's a wonderful poem that was always very popular or widely read called The Fish, that she wrote in the 1940s, I think. I'm trying to have to look back. And it's, again, it's, it could be any fish. It could be any fisher person, male or female, catching a fish and admiring the fish and seeing that the fish is battle scarred, actually, and has survived many, like it's got 5 or 6 hooks in it, and it's a beautiful fish. And in the end, she lets the fish go, and she sees, a kind of rainbow in the oil slick behind the motor of the little, putt-putt boat that she's on. And it's a vision, an ecstatic vision, rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. You don't have to have been there with that particular fish to have a kind of transcendent vision of, this other being, a kind of almost human other animal, and its travails, in which you identify, and then you let him go and give the life back to that struggling, battle-scarred fish, who, maybe that's you as well. So I think you're right that her poetry is more universal than, as it turns out, the poetry of the confessionals was.
Gracias. Sí, la siguiente pregunta es de Janet Aguilar. Ella pregunta, ¿cuáles son los temas de Bishop que considera que la mantienen vigente y que siguen impactando a las jóvenes generaciones de poetas? Y otra pregunta, ¿cuáles son para ti, Megan, los temas que más te obsesiona, en los que más te obsesiona seguir indagando?
Well, as to the topics that Bishop wrote about, and that, I often ask other poets, what are your favorite poems of hers? And she writes quite a few poems just about the common person in Brazil, for example, or really anywhere. There's a poem called Filling Station, about stopping by at a gas station, we would say, and in Brazil, and it's not so much that she doesn't actually see the people there, but she can tell by the little potted plants and the lace doilies, that this is a place, even this God-forsaken place, is a place of the spirit and of divinity. So she can find the divine in the commonplace. There's another that's about, just the town pump in the small village in Brazil where she was living, and the people who gathered there and what they're talking about, and another kind of ecstatic rainbow vision comes from that. So I think she grew up, one of her grandfathers was well-to-do in Worcester, Massachusetts, and through him she could go to the boarding school, she could go to Vassar College, but the grandparents she really loved and felt safe with were in this great village, a little tiny town in Nova Scotia, and that grandfather had been a tanner, tanning hides back when that was possible. And they, living a very primitive life. And that was what she was always, I think, yearning for and longing for, and why she had a great understanding for all sorts of people. I think that's one of the reasons she wanted to learn Spanish. Was she lived in New York City for a while, she lived in Key West, and that was the language that was spoken by so many people, and she wanted to understand it. That's kind of who she was. She didn't have very, that her own sense of being adrift and having a precarious life caused her to identify with other people whose lives were precarious. She wrote a kind of ballad about a Robin Hood-like figure in the favela in Rio, who was, being sought by the police. And that was a long poem that's almost like a children's rhyme, but and it was published in a special edition with beautiful illustrations. But she was always rooting for the common person. And so, as far as the things that I'm obsessed by, that's a very good question. I'm very interested in women's struggle to be heard, and in women's the obstacles that women face of all sorts to find their voice. And that's really a common theme through all the books that I've written.
Muchas gracias. Reyes Martínez pregunta por el impacto del trasiego de la mudanza de Bishop por el mundo para construir su mundo poético, tanto en Brasil, en Francia, inclusive en México, y también con el contacto añadido de los idiomas en este proceso de desarrollo. Es decir, qué tanto impactó esta mudanza constante y estos idiomas a su obra.
That's a very good question. She really struggled in Brazil because she had learned Spanish pretty well, and she found it really difficult to take in the Portuguese. Although she did most of the translation that she did and that she published was from the Portuguese. She'd also spent a fair amount of time in France and was kind of taken by the Surrealist poets. She wrote at one point that she believed in a kind of surrealism of everyday life. That is, again, objects can take on huge meanings, even if they're small, that kind of thing. But English was her language. She didn't write in any other language. She did read, though. I was impressed. She read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in French, which was a lucky thing because the English translation was terrible from what I've learned. A lot left out, and so it was interesting. She liked it quite a lot, and of course a lot of people did, but some reviewers were critical, and she couldn't understand that, having read it in French, I guess. Some reviewers in English. But I think there's also this sestina form, interestingly, goes back it's not an English form, it's sort of Italian and Spanish and French, that it's a very ancient form, and she was one of the people who revived it. Now, if you go to a MFA program, you probably have to be assigned to write a sestina. I wrote a sestina. We all practiced it, but when she started writing this in 1936, I think it was, A Miracle for Breakfast, hardly anyone was writing that way. And so that's another way in which her, deep investigation of the forms of poetry, which she approached through English poetry, still took her back to a kind of global sense, or at least, transcontinental or intercontinental origins of poetry that she then helped her become an original poet.
Muchas gracias. A continuación tenemos la pregunta de Néstor Ramírez que dice, buen día, un par de preguntas. ¿Cómo fue el proceso de rescate de sus poemas, cartas y documentos que estaban en Brasil y otros países? ¿Cuál es la conexión de Bishop y el mar y qué significaba el mar para ella? Gracias.
Those are good questions. I wish I knew more precisely about how these letters were gathered. I know that not too long after she died, her publisher, Robert Giroux, decided to publish a collection of her letters, and I think he must have written to all of her friends and said, please send. But there are also many, I mean, and I guess, you know, I don't know, they have ended up, most of them at Vassar College. And the sea, she loved travel by boat. I mean, she loved the ocean. She loved to sail. That was something she learned in the summer camp on Cape Cod. And she was really drawn to port cities such as Key West and fishing. She loved to fish. And she loved the beaches of Brazil. And she also loved travel, you know, when she went to Brazil at first, she had these friends, Lota Jameseiro Soares, and who had been in a relationship with a former dancer, Mary Morse, and she was planning to stop and visit them and continue on. She had bought a ticket to some kind of I don't know if it's a passenger liner or like a just a cargo ship, but she could go, she could stop as long as she wanted at any port going around South America, but she stopped only in Brazil and stayed there and never went on to any of the other ports. But she one of the things she also did aside from writing poetry was she painted watercolors, and there's some lovely paintings of the inside of the cabins where she would when she was on a ship. She liked that being in between places where not much was expected of you. She hated having people expect her to turn out poetry in any kind of regular way. She just had to write, when the idea was, when the moment came. I mean, there are poems that in fact, that's one of the great discoveries in these letters to her psychoanalyst from 1947. In one of them, she's writing about an experience which she'd been in Nova Scotia the summer before, she's writing about in this letter, and she said, and she had been on a bender, and that morning she took her bike to a beach and saw a seal, and the seal's eyes connected. She felt she was communicating with the seal, and anyway, she says, and then I saw the poem. That's what she said. So that, this moment that became a really great poem called At the Fish Houses, she knew that was a moment. She knew that was a poem, but it took her a while to write it. And even longer, in these same letters from 1947, she wrote about being on a bus trip, also in Nova Scotia, and a moose stepping out on the road to stop the bus, and how everyone in the bus kind of was startled. And anyway, it's ended up as a beautiful poem that she wrote almost 20 years later, maybe more than 20 years later, in 1971, I have to do the math, more than 20 years later, called The Moose. And, there that experience had been with her all that time to become the poem, The Moose. So I think I veered off from what the question was. Oh, the sea, right, the sea. Really, another really great poem is called The Sandpiper, about a little sandpiper running the beach. And it's so much more than about the sandpiper. It's kind of about anybody with an obsessive interest in something, such as she did, always looking for something, poor bird. And so there's the sea and the shore, and that, the borders of things interested her very much. So yes, the sea was sea water in that at the fish houses. She talks about putting her hand down into the very cold water and experiencing a kind of knowledge through that. It becomes a metaphor for gaining wisdom, the cold and deep truths of the world. That's in the ocean and at the shore.
Muchas gracias, pues estamos concluyendo. Agradecemos a todas y a todos que nos hayan acompañado, especialmente a nuestra autora Megan Marshall, y esperamos tenerte pronto en México para que sigamos hablando sobre Elizabeth Bishop y también tu obra. Si quisieras dirigirnos algunas palabras finales, Megan.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to say I'm very thankful for Vaso Roto, for their commitment to Elizabeth Bishop as a poet, and for helping me bring the story of her life that really surrounds these poems and supports the poems to this readers in the Spanish-speaking world, which is such an important, it's the whole world. So thank you.
Muchas gracias a todas y a todos. En un momento más vamos a tener esta conferencia de prensa en las redes sociales de Vaso Roto y agradecemos a las dos Marías en España y en México por su apoyo para la realización de este evento y de la traducción. Y gracias a todos. Hasta pronto.
Thank you. Bye-bye.